Thank you, everyone. So our first panel of the day, the image of Black and Western art. We'd like to welcome our moderator, David Beinman, Harvard University. Our panelists, Tanya Sheehan, Colby College. Jan Marsh, National Portrait Gallery, London. Monica Miller, Barnard College. Jillian Hernandez, University of California, San Diego. And Kate Lowe, Queen Mary University of London.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm not going to thank lots of people. I think everyone's been very comprehensively thanked. The one exception I will make is for Deb Willis. So can we have a round of applause once again for Deb, please? I've been asked to introduce this session by talking briefly about the Image of the Black in Western Art series, and it will be brief. And I'm delighted to see how many of the contributors to it are present at this conference. And can I ask them all to stand up? Tanya doesn't need to stand up, but Paul Kaplan, where are you? And Esther Schroeder, good. And Adrian Childs, good, excellent, just checking they're all here. Deb Willis, yes, Will Fjorty, and then Vera Grant. Good, excellent, thank you. Just making sure they were up early enough to be here. As most of you will know, the series was initiated by Dominique and Jean de Menil of Houston and Paris, and the first volumes on the ancient world, the Middle Ages and the 19th century, were published in 1975, 1979, and 1989. They were edited in Paris and were written by French scholars, with the one exception of Frank Snowden, who is African-American, and Hugh Honor, who is British. By the early 1990s, 3 volumes in 5 books had been published, but there was nothing on the period 1500 to 1800. Dominique, on the advice of David Friedberg, set up 3 teams to do a book each, and after many vicissitudes, and I won't go into detail here, I think largely because of libel laws, the project was taken over by the Du Bois Institute at Harvard under the leadership of Skip Gates. I was tasked by Skip to produce a plan for completing the series, and in 2009, Harvard University Press stepped in to propose a reprinting of the whole series with new introductions to the old volumes, as well as the 3 new volumes. And I should say, if you have the old volumes, you do need to get rid of them and buy the new volumes. They came out between 2010 to 2012, and then it was agreed to bring out 2 new books on the 20th century, which appeared last year. I can further announce that 2 companion volumes are projected. One that is due out next year is The Image of the Black in Africa and Asia, and the final, and it will be the final one, I promise you, is The Image of the European in African art, to finally get rid of the Eurocentrism of the series. Now, I just want to briefly stress a few points. First of all, the volumes provide introductions to aspects of the subject and are not definitive. Indeed, the present conference and this session is precisely the kind of outcome we hoped for, and I take enormous pleasure in signs of the volume's influence. Secondly, it is an evolving project that has developed over 50 years of immense social and intellectual change. What began as a response to the civil rights struggle in the 1960s and 70s has proved to be particularly relevant to the age of Obama, and of course, history of art has changed immeasurably in the light of postmodernism and post-colonialism. The result is that the volumes are in perpetual debate with themselves and reflect deliberately the changing agendas that have affected the political debate and art history. The reprinted volumes have new introductions by present-day scholars. that create a vivid dialogue between past and present. For instance, Jeremy Tanner's introduction to the volume on classical art brings to the fore a new sophistication in matters of representation and evaluates the importance of Martin Bernal's Black Athena theory. And the new volumes on the 20th century, in fact, go up to the present day, and Cobina Mercer has, among other things, been able to look at current issues around post-blackness. So, again, just the final point is that if you do decide to get rid of the first editions and buy the new ones, they do sell in the US for $95, but they are available on Amazon for $60. And the press won't thank me for telling you this, but that is the case. So hurry to your local bookshops. Now, the first of our speakers is Tanya Sheehan, who's Associate Professor in the Department of Art at Colby College and the author of Doctored, The Medicine of Photography in 19th Century America. And she also contributed an important essay co-authored with Skip Gates on popular imagery to volume 5.1 of The Image of the Black, and her talk will reflect on that contribution. She will then be followed by Jan Marsh, who's a very distinguished curator attached to the National Portrait Gallery in London and was responsible for a wonderful exhibition in Manchester and Birmingham called Black Victorians. And then this will be followed by a paper by Monica Miller, who is Associate Professor of English and Africana Studies at Barnard College, Columbia University, and she's talking about a subject that relates directly to concerns in the image of the black, that is the presence of black models in 19th century European academies. And it follows on from Hugh Honor's discussion of the case of Wilson, the African-American model who caused a sensation at the Royal Academy around 1810. This will be followed by a paper by Gillian Hernandez, who is Assistant Professor in the Ethnic Studies Department, the University of California in San Diego, and her paper is about the rap artist Nicki Minaj and her deployment of the Rococo, something that was controversial in the 18th century, and the talk relates to discussions in more than one volume of The Image of the Black. And then the final paper is by Kate Lowe, the Professor of Renaissance History at Queen Mary College, University of London, who's best known as, in the present context, as joint editor of Black Africans in Renaissance Europe, a highly important series of essays that came out in 2005. And she'd be talking about the presence of Africans in Portugal in the 16th century. So we start now with Tanya. Would you like to?
So thank you, David. Thank you, Skip in absentia, for bringing me into this project, and Deb for inviting me here today. Thank you. So today, I want to open up debate about an assumption held by many scholars and artists. And that assumption is that popular images of blackness that were created in the white cultural imagination have no proper or productive place in art histories of the African diaspora. Motivating my critique of this assumption is the recent expansion and republication of the Image of the Black in Western Art series by Harvard University Press, on which David Beinman has just spoken. So in 2012 and 2014, Beinman and Skip Gates introduced new volumes on 19th century and 20th century art, and with them an unprecedented interest in the ideas and feelings about blackness expressed in popular visual culture. Here I'm referring to illustrated books, toys, magazines, advertisements, commercial packaging, posters, postcards, decorative arts, including the Blackamoor figures, vernacular photography, and other collectible objects. The critical attention paid to such mass-produced and often degrading images of Black people presents an important opportunity to reflect on the value of keeping such images alive and visible in the 21st century. And this is an opportunity that's also provided to all of us here in Florence by the Resignifications exhibition. Do I control the slides? I think I do. Okay. The early volumes of the Image of the Black series included relatively few but important examples of racial stereotyping in Euro-American visual culture. The first part of Volume 4, for example, reproduced British satirical prints that targeted the slave trade, as well as illustrations from the American best-selling novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. Print caricatures also appeared in the volume's second part, among them Edward Clay's comic vision of life in Philadelphia and the well-known lithograph of T.D. Rice as the first blackface minstrel, Jim Crow. And yet these surveys of Black representation to World War I are dominated by canonical Euro-American artworks that, while stereotypical, would have been read as positive depictions of Black bodies by contemporary white viewers. That this is the case should not be surprising, given the historical aims of Image of the Black studies. In the decades after John and Dominique DeMille launched their research project in 1960, exhibitions and related publications in the US sought to make visible Black bodies across the American canon. The portrayal of the Negro in American painting at Bowdoin College, and later Facing History at the Corcoran Gallery of Art, specifically highlighted sympathetic renderings of African Americans in paintings by Thomas Eakins, John Singleton Copley, and other celebrated masters. What they did not do was showcase the derogatory racial stereotypes that pervaded every form of Euro-American visual culture from the late 18th century to the early 20th century. In her critique of the Facing History exhibition in 1990, feminist critic Michelle Wallace described this deliberate omission as troubling and unproductive. Writing in the magazine Art in America, she explained, and I quote, "I would hope that the principal purpose for studying images of Blacks in visual art is to gain insight into cultural racism," unquote. For Wallace, such insight comes from thinking deeply about, rather than denying, how African Americans have been demeaned through caricature and rendered virtually invisible as subjects and producers of art. There's nothing to be gained, in other words, from erasing another form of erasure. Within the field of African American art history, however, desires to empower long-silenced voices and to honor Black cultural production have made engagement with popular images difficult at best. We can see this difficulty vividly in writing on the art of the early 20th century New Negro movement. Recall that in 1943, African American critic James Porter admonished Palmer Hayden for producing, quote, satirical pictures of Negro life in Harlem in the paintings you see here. And this is The Janitor Who Paints on the left from 1930 and Midsummer Night in Harlem on the right from 1936. Porter declared the humor in The Janitor Who Paints, quote, ill-advised, if not altogether tasteless, unquote, while comparing Midsummer Night in Harlem to, quote, one of those ludicrous billboards that once were plastered on public buildings to advertise blackface minstrels. Recently, art historian Phoebe Wolfskill argued that both Hayden and his contemporary Archibald Motley Jr. complicated White's stereotypical images of the Black, but, quote, they did not consistently exhibit distancing and irony, unquote. In fact, Wolfskill framed the presence of racial caricature in African American art as evidence that pervasive and harmful images of Black identity insinuated themselves in the consciousness of those artists seeking to resist them. Underlying this argument is the assumption with which I began, that white-generated stereotypes have no proper place or productive role in African American modernism, and specifically within its discourse of self-determination. As historian Glenda Carpio has demonstrated, however, there is a rich tradition of African American humor in African American humor of appropriating and critiquing racial stereotypes. Carpio locates this tradition in the art of Robert Colescott and Kara Walker. So at the top of the screen is Colescott's George Washington Carver Crossing the Delaware from 1975, which reinterprets through racial caricature Emanuel Leutz's iconic Washington Crossing the Delaware. And below is Walker's panoramic arrangement of cut paper silhouettes titled The End of Uncle Tom and the grand allegorical tableau of Eva in Heaven from 1995, which turns upside down the world of Stowe's sentimental novel. According to Carpio, these artists, quote, give life to the most taboo aspects of race and sexuality in America, ultimately seeking to effect a liberating sabotage of the past's hold on the present, unquote. That popular images productively informed Black artistic production motivated the incorporation of popular images into Volume 5 of the Image of the Black in Western Art. For the first time in the series, an entire chapter was devoted to the astonishing number of mass-produced images of people of African descent that objectified and caricatured, propagating ideas about the supposedly immutable nature of Black bodies. The purpose of that chapter, which I co-authored with Skip Gates, was to use a small selection of images from the US and Europe as a backdrop of sorts to the art of the 20th century. Our earliest image was this British advertisement for Pear's soap from the 1880s, which equated Blackness with filth and imagined it as something that could be put on and removed for humorous effect, a notion undoubtedly influenced by the blackface minstrel show. To show how Europeans envisioned Black men as brutes in the context of struggles for military and political power, we selected this Italian poster from World War II. Its pairing of a grotesquely featured Black soldier with the Venus de Milo invited the Italian public to associate the Allied forces with sexualized political violence and cultural defilement. Another group of popular images spoke to the mass reproduction and dissemination of racist material culture over the last 150 years. In the US, these took the form of everything from mechanical banks to cookie jars. In 1889, the Quaker Oats Company adopted the Aunt Jemima or, quote, mammy stereotype as its trademark, using it to bolster the authenticity of what it called its Southern pancake mix. While such images were meant to confirm the subservience of Black people and to stimulate pleasure at the sight of their imagined physical, social, and intellectual inferiority, artists of the African diaspora responded to them in the second half of the 20th century by appropriating and undermining their anti-Black messages. Thus, the second part of the Volume 5 of The Image of the Black includes artists who signified upon racist images by retrieving them from history and subverting them through pastiche, parody, and satire. Reproduced in the book are the meditations on the mammy stereotype that you see on the screen. This is Joe Overstreet's The New Jemima from 1964 on the left, and Betty Saar's The Liberation of Aunt Jemima from 1972 on the right. While both artists militarized the figure, Saar went a step further by literally incorporating into her assemblage relics of the denigrating history of the image of the Black in Western material culture, only to drain them of their power. These artworks by Colescott and Walker, which I showed you before, also appear in Volume 5 to demonstrate that degrading images nevertheless remain dangerous territory for Black and white viewers alike. This message was made clear in 1997 when Betty Saar herself launched a letter-writing campaign to boycott Kara Walker's body-silhouetted satires. Saar's response to Walker pointed to the risks of allowing negative images to run amok in Image of the Black studies and Euro-American art historiography. But is the solution to police or sanitize these fields to such an extent that we become blind to the complex visual strategies of modern and postmodern artists? Both gestures generated discomfort that scholars have a responsibility to recognize and interrogate. And what of our decision to segregate popular images in the newest volumes of The Image of the Black in Western Art? Might the editors have anticipated among readers the assumption with which this talk began, that popular images of blackness have no proper or productive place in art histories of the African diaspora? And this is a truly honest question for David and Skip. Was it motivated by a desire, in other words, to acknowledge the importance of racial stereotypes to art histories of the diaspora, and to acknowledge the discomfort that their presence clearly generates among black and white readers alike? On the matter of discomfort and its critical effects, I'd like to give the last word to African-American artist Michael Ray Charles, who has spoken openly about the uneasy feelings his own artwork generated in the late 1990s. Discussed by Kobina Mercer in Volume 5 of The Image of the Black, Charles has become well known, and some would say infamous, for resuscitating and monumentalizing racist visual tropes. He does precisely that in this combination of Mickey Mouse and Sambo, both of which are legacies of the American minstrel show. The painting's title suggests that we should beware, but of what exactly? Should we fear the conflation of Sambo with Walt Disney's beloved alter ego? Or should we be afraid of images that erase or deny their own racism, including many images produced by the Disney Corporation? Michael Ray Charles has admitted that the questions he poses through his paintings are not always welcomed by viewers and critics. Quote, "A lot of blacks don't want to see images like mine. Perhaps they bring up too much pain," he explained. "A lot of whites are embarrassed and feel ashamed by them. But out of sight, out of mind doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It happened, and I feel it has not been dealt with," unquote. By it, Charles presumably speaks of racism and visual culture. But as scholars, let us remember that it could also be the erasures enacted by our historiographical choices. In seeking to set some black artists and artworks apart from the racist muck of the past and present, are we not denying opportunities to explore fully the contexts in which they have emerged and in which they have generated meaning? When is such denial productive? And when might it be detrimental, critically and creatively? These are questions with which I hope we will continue to grapple. Thank you.
Yes, I would like to comment on that because the decision to produce a chapter on this was something that had quite a history, and it really goes back to an exhibition that Esther Schroeder was involved in Amsterdam called Black is Beautiful. And the whole exhibition was premised and quite deliberately stated that they were not going to show any offensive images. In fact, that's not true. There were some that were offensive, but they were deliberately got rid of caricature and popular stereotyping as far as possible. And I felt that was just simply wrong, because although it did avoid offense, but it also avoided history as well. But on the other hand, the other problem with the volumes, that you could easily simply swamp the volumes with really horrible imagery, and that wasn't an acceptable possibility either. So, in a way, the idea of having a chapter was to raise the question, but also to confine it. And one of the guiding ideas was not just simply to show racist imagery for its own sake, but to single out what I would regard as the kind of insidious imagery. In other words, the imagery that unthinking people might think isn't really racist, like Aunt Jemima. And it's also that kind of imagery that's been particularly taken up by artists and who appear, as Tanya said, in the volume elsewhere. And so there is always a dialogue between this, really very extremely unpleasant racist imagery and also the way in which artists have dealt with it. But it is an open question, and there are limits, I think, to what you want to show, and certainly we didn't show some of the really really even more unpleasant imagery that there is. And it's a continual and living question, really. And it is clearly offensive, a lot of that material, but it seems to me you just have to tell the truth and tell the story as it actually happened, and it's a responsibility of historians to do that.
David, I just want to point out that Skip and I were not allowed to reproduce images of Tintin in the Congo.
Yes, I know, yes, but...
We talked about it,
Yeah.
but we were not given permission to include the images.
Well, of course, they do reproduce them still, and you can still buy Tintin in Africa, in Brussels, but they didn't want it to be any illustrations in connection with discussions of race. The only consolation is that we heard about it enough time to put a protest in the text itself, to point out what they were doing. Good. Okay, well, let's move on to the next one, to Jan Marsh.
Yes. Echo thanks and congratulations to the whole organisational team.
Yes.
Yesterday I learnt a lot, and I'm looking forward to learning a whole lot more today and tomorrow. Western art is still perceived as overwhelmingly white in imagery, but if one had been in any doubt about how consistent the black presence has been throughout European history, these magisterial volumes edited by Professor Bindman demonstrate just how constant that presence has been, with significant variations and phases. And the black presence first major appearance in Western art really came with the depictions of the Epiphany and the adoration of the Magi, when devotional art was dominant. Sorry, I don't know quite what I'm doing. In line with developing Western theology, the three kings are being identified as representing the three then known continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And conventionally, they were dubbed Melchior, Caspar, and Balthasar, with variations. And very quickly, this notion spread throughout Europe in church art of all grades. Recently, I saw an exhibition of early carved altarpieces from the medieval Hungarian Empire, each with its black king and his attendant. And in the Renaissance, there was scarcely an artist who did not paint this subject, some of them many times. So all Christendom was familiar with these images of Africans as high-status worshippers, richly dressed, elaborately attended, exotic and impressive figures. However complex the interpretation of their iconographies, as it were, and mindful of David's perennial question of the relation between actual observation and artistic convention, their presence in art certainly testifies to the African presence in Europe, because these are figures drawn and painted from life. They are individuated presences. They indicate real-life models of whose own lives one can only speculate. Yet I wonder if, knowing the range of African physiognomies as they exist, one might guess at the geographical origins and the ways that these models, or their forebears, came to Europe across the Mediterranean, doubtless. In art, the black presence is dominantly male, but women feature in allegorical and mythological subjects, as here in Titian's Poesia of Diana and her nymphs, with a dark-skinned mortal whose robe seems to be a variant of those worn in the Caribbean. And by the mid-1500s, more and more Africans arrived in Europe via, as it were, through enslavement, and, as we know, became exotic and often finely dressed household servants. In the late 1500s and early 1600s, however, one main point of contact was with the Moroccan Empire of Northwest Africa, the Barbary States, as they were known in Europe, and that vast hinterland behind. And so important was Morocco in the polity of this period that its leading figures were incorporated into the emergent art of portraiture, of European portraiture. including the grandest genre of portraiture, the equestrian portrait. Kings, again, high-status diplomats, those are who feature. The fellow on the left was ambassador to the court of Elizabeth I of England, because as well as Shakespeare's Othello, the soldier, you will know the Prince of Morocco in The Merchant of Venice. And as important as the rulers of Morocco, as important to Europe almost, were the horses of Morocco. The Barbary horses. They were imported largely through Marseille, and they were very highly prized and very expensive. And in aristocratic portraits, a fine horse is a signifier of wealth and noble status. But we always note the presence of dark-skinned grooms, as they're known in these pictures. And I wondered did European nobles actually employ African slaves to care for these beasts? Equestrian care and training is a very highly skilled occupation, and I believe that these valued horses came with their trainers, their mounts. These representations are of grooms coming from North and West Africa, because the people there, or where the people, men anyway, were famed for their horsemanship. Because as well as bringing horses as gifts for the King of England in the 1600s, the delegation from the Barbary states gave stunning displays of equestrian skill in Hyde Park in 1682, for example, as recorded by John Evelyn, flinging and catching their lances at full speed. So this was a very impressive demonstration to the British. And throughout Europe, I think we can see a migrant group of valued horsemen with their mounts. And they are depicted as diminutive figures, I assume for reasons of pictorial decorum, so as not to compete visually with their noble employers, who are usually featured in the paintings too. And I'm guessing that they're shown wearing an artistic impression of their own tunics or garments, which is why they're dressed. This naive painting is in fact a portrait of horses belonging to one nobleman, William Cavendish, later Duke of Newcastle, and the animals' names are actually inscribed on a plaque fixed to the bottom of the frame, which actually indicates the horses' celebrity rather than their grooms. And so we're fascinated to see we have 2 white and 3 black grooms, presumably also at the time recognizable individuals, though their names are not recorded. Because these were performance horses, they were items of display for European aristocrats. They're the origin of the Spanish riding school in Vienna under the Habsburg, the Andalusian school of equestrian art in Spain, and that whole tradition of dressage that we know today. This is a picture from the Netherlands of horses being trained to dance around on the spot round a pole. And again, the foremost trainer is dark-skinned. And I think this is a vanished history that's only recorded in visual art, because I don't know, I'd love to know if there are any documented records of the men who came with their mounts from the Barbary states. Over the 1600s, more and more depictions of black figures, that's members of the African diaspora throughout Europe, often are seen, often as artistic studies done from life, showing that this was part of pictorial training in Flanders, Britain, France. In the 1700s, black portraiture developed, recording celebrated individuals, again mainly men, as well as the sort of native European, rich and powerful. And we get into much more familiar art historical territory here. And it seems to me that this is European history, that it behoves European scholars to investigate and analyze these aspects of European art history that sometimes have been overlooked, although happily not so recently. And the most celebrated black sitter in Europe was the African-American actor Ira Aldridge, renowned throughout the continent, from Ireland to Russia, especially Russia, in fact, for his dramatic portrayals of Shakespearean heroines. And I'd like to pull the story forward, Shakespearean heroes, to Aldridge's celebrated successor, the actor and singer Paul Robeson, whose European fame eclipsed that, I think, in the US, and who was to have played Aldridge in a biopic that was never realized. David and I are working on an exhibition proposal linking these two exceptional individuals, so if anyone's interested in hearing more about that, please get in touch. Thus into the Victorian age, with much migration around the world. These are two famous figures of African ancestry who were in Paris. We know the name of the man, but we don't know the name of the African Venus, probably from the French Caribbean. And as sculptures, they were terrifically popular in art. One model we do know about is Fanny Eaton, born in Jamaica, married in London, and employed by many British artists in the 1860s. And drawings and paintings of Fanny Eaton are still coming to light. So she sat for very, very many artists, and we recognize her when we see her in drawings and paintings. Finally, to Miss Lala, the circus artist in this famous painting by Degas. Given the importance or the popularity of French Impressionism, it's surprising that no one really investigated her identity earlier, nor even really noted her ethnicity, which Degas did not emphasize in this oil painting. And even now, critics normally focus on the pictorial, aesthetic, innovative aspects of the painting rather than its subject, unlike some other figures in art who are subject to intense investigation into their own personal histories and personalities. Miss Lala, it seems, is merely a circus performer. Miss Lala was her stage name, of course, or one name under which she performed. And when this photograph of her came to light, unmistakably the same costume. I had no idea of her offstage identity, but researchers have found that she was born in what is now Poland, performed in circus acts throughout Europe, across Europe, notably in Paris, but also in Britain, and married a fellow performer, an American contortionist who became circus manager. And at the age of 60, she acquired or applied for an American passport to leave Europe, presumably to economic depression and so on. And that seems all we know so far. So if Miss Lala died in the United States, one would like to know the story of the rest of her life. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just to add one tiny footnote to that Ira Aldridge's daughter was Amanda Aldridge, was a famous teacher of music and also elocution, and she apparently coached Paul Robeson for his Othello in 1933. So you've got these extraordinary continuities in among black actors in the 19th all the way through to the 20th century. Next paper, Monica, would you?
Good morning. This paper is the very beginning of a project that, the very beginning and a very small part of a project that I'm working on that is about theorizing Black diaspora in places that purportedly don't have a colonial or imperial past, or an elaborated colonial or imperial past. And I'm focusing on Sweden and people of African descent, people of the Black diaspora, writ very large in Sweden, both historically and contemporarily. So this paper is a sort of middle piece of that story. In Ralph Ellison's 1952 novel, which we heard a little bit about this morning, Invisible Man, the central part of the text recounts an unnamed narrator and protagonist's negotiation of two political ideologies. One, named the Brotherhood, is multiracial and colorblind. The other, unnamed but of Black nationalist origin, we might call color conscious. In a dark alley in Harlem, the Invisible Man and Ross the Extorter, or exhorter, the Black nationalist leader, confront each other, and Ross shouts, and I'm going to quote a little bit of his exhortation. "You my brother, man. Brothers are the same color. How the hell you call these white men brother? Brothers the same color. We sons of Mama Africa. You done forgot? You black. Black. You got bad hair. You got thick lips. They say you stink. They hate you, man. You African. African. They enslave us. You forget that? How can they mean a black man any good? How are they going to be your brother? Roz, recognize your black possibilities, man. Don't be stupid, man. Where's your black intelligence?" Imploring the Invisible Man to wake up and recognize his exploitation, Ross insists that the Invisible Man's visibility, his coming into consciousness, is indelibly associated with his identity as black and of African descent. Ever aware of the necessity and difficulty of Black solidarity, Ellison stages this scene as a philosophical exploration of the relation of invisibility and visibility to possibilities of blackness. Is Black humanity the same as humanity? Can one claim both simultaneously? Can one recognize blackness and humanity at the same time? Does one provide access to or block the other? Writ large, at issue here is the nature and possibilities of difference. In this case, the differences of race, ethnicity, and nation, born of the diaspora that the trade in African slaves, colonialism, and imperialism brought. It is this long shared history that created specifically Black possibilities and possibilities of blackness. It is the relation of these two ideas that I would like to explore in another dark alley in late 19th century Södermalm's Stockholm, Sweden, a European place that has long considered itself exceptional and seemingly somewhat new to difference, blackness, diaspora, and the challenges that these bring to belonging. In the late 19th century, like many other European nations, Sweden was modernizing, consolidating regional cultures and geographic differences into Swedish nationality, creating Swedishness as specific and recognizable. According to Jeff Werner, art historian and author of Blond och blåögd, Blonde and Blue-Eyed, Whiteness, Swedishness, and Visual Culture, Swedishness became overwhelmingly associated with whiteness, and whiteness with Swedishness during the late 19th century. The world of visual culture both created and reflected the fact that one had to truly look Swedish in order to be Swedish. What do Swedes look like? Typical Swedes have pale skin, straight blonde hair, blue eyes. They are tall, with excellent posture and athletic builds. Werner argues by the turn of the 20th century, Swedish visual culture, its institutions, including museums and art schools, and its examples, including oil and watercolor painting, even and perhaps explicitly, or not explicitly, but most obviously landscapes, snow, advertisements and cartoons, created Swedishness as a specific whiteness, a whiteness that even the Germans praised as the best example of Aryan stock. To explain Swedish exceptionality, Werner writes, the close relationship between Swedish whiteness is evident in the nearly total invisibility of non-white Swedishness. Swedes who are not white are defined by white normalizing society as belonging altogether to other ethnicities and cultures. In this respect, Sweden differs from many other countries. Although Britishness, Frenchness, or Americanness is primarily white, For everyone except racists, I wonder about this, these countries see little or no contradiction between nationality and color. In Sweden, then as now, identity, both personal and national, is overwhelmingly color conscious, even as the state itself claims official color blindness and works to erase race as an identity category. I'll say more about this later. It is during the same time, the late 19th century, that a black man may have been seen walking south from Stockholm's harbor, up Katarinavägen, on to Renstjärnesgatan, and then home to Skånegatan 11 in Söder, the large island home to Stockholm's working class and Jews during that time. He would be returning home after a long day working as a stevedore on the docks. One of possibly two black men living and working in Stockholm at the time, he led a relatively anonymous life, quietly negotiating his status as both a long-term resident and främling, or stranger in the nation's capital. In Swedish, there's an old saying, "Kärt barn har många namn," or "beloved children have many names." This man, variously known as Jean-Pierre Louis, Pierre Louis Alexander, P.L. Alexanderson, Svarte Uno, Black One, Svarte Pedro, Black Peter, or most pejoratively and frequently, Neger Pettersson, which is the Peterson Negro or nigger, would seem to be loved indeed. While this last name, the one that he himself is reported to have used most often, indicates that this love was fraught, if it existed at all, we do know that he was indeed esteemed by an unexpected group of Stockholmers, the artists of the Kungliga Akademia för Fria Konsterna, or the Royal Art School, for whom he served as an artist model. While there are few traces of Neger Pettersson's actual life, there are currently extant at least 28 paintings and drawings of him, 2 photographs that show him posing in the school's atelier, 2 structural busts, one of which bears the name Zambo. These artworks were created by some of Sweden's best-known artists, including Oscar Björk, Johan Krottien, Eka Hedberg, and Karin Bergö Larsson, the wife of the acclaimed artist and designer Carl Larsson, some of the very architects of Swedish whiteness. Said to be a native of French Guiana who made his way to Sweden on a ship transporting sugar via Bahia, Brazil, and possibly also New York, Jean-Pierre landed in Sweden on the 20th of April, 1863, around the age of 20. The captain of the ship was named Pettersson. Jean-Louis is thought to be either a fugitive slave or a recently freed man escaping French colonization and its aftermath. Likewise, he may have abandoned the ship when it docked in Stockholm. He disappears from the record for the next 15 years, although it seems possible that during this time he met and then married or cohabited with a woman from Öland, which is a large rural island off the mainland, who worked selling food to dock workers, with whom he may have had 2 children. He emerges again in 1878 on the payroll of the Royal Academy and in community registers, using the name Pettersson. Pierre Louis's invisibility and hypervisibility is also marked under these years. He is relatively invisible and anonymous, as there are few verifiable records of his presence in Stockholm, apart from a number of addresses and the probability of marriage and children. At the same time, he is strikingly recorded in visual culture by means of his modeling at the Royal Art Academy, and in oral culture as the subject of a macabre children's rhyme sung over the next century. Known as Neger Skäringen, or the nigger lover/witch, his wife, Christina, committed suicide in 1889 after she was the sufferer of an incurable illness. Pierre was the one who found her hanged from a beam in their basement. The rhyme records the report a grief-stricken husband gave to the police in broken Swedish. I'll skip that. During his time in Sweden from 1863 to 1905, when he died, we see his presence marked as both foreign recorded in urban legend and mocked linguistically, and also his presence as familiar, as his humanity was recorded in oil and watercolor. The portraits of Jean-Louis Pierre and their variety and typicality allow us to think and look backwards and forwards into Swedish history and its relationship that has developed among its black and brown strangers and now citizens, its color-conscious past and its colorblind presence. I guess I'm getting the time signal, so I'll just show you some of the images. This first image is by Oscar Björk, where we see Pierre Louis dressed as a typical Moor, earringed, turbaned, with a scimitar, clad in rich colors and flowing fabrics. He exhibits a kind of nobility and strength here, and perhaps, I'm trying to think this through, a kind of provocative menace. This is Björk's second portrait of him on the right. which is a little bit more of the same. And then on the left is Eke Hedebare's very different portrait of him that kind of puts him in a more typical setting. Seems to depict an actual man. This portrait is by Karen Berrieux Larsen, which is kind of blends a little bit of the Moor with the sailor. And we see here a kind of really specific and true-to-life rendering of bad hair and thick lips that are really rendered, I think, really naturalistically. He's not in costume here. He seems to be much more of a kind of character. These final two portraits, this one by an unnamed artist, and this last drawing, show him a little bit older. Again, kind of looking more naturalistic, a portrait of him as kind of perhaps how he was. What I'm interested in thinking about these portraits is the way that they allow us to look back into a Swedish past that actually does include colonialism and imperialism, that includes the building of a fake slave fort in Ghana, the colonization of St. Bart's, the island of St. Bart's for 100 years, the supplying of voyage iron for all of the slave ships that were traveling a transatlantic route. So it allows us to look back to Sweden's past as a player in the slave trade and imperialism, and also allows us to look forward to a group of people of African descent who now live in Sweden, right, who feel as if they have no link to a kind of blackness that is surrounded by a kind of whiteness, right? So I'm using these portraits of Pettersson, I'm done, Pettersson to both look backwards and to look forwards into the diaspora of black folks in Sweden. Thank you.
Thank you. That's extremely interesting. And of course, there were many black models in the 19th century in Europe, and the most famous one being Wilson, who was a sailor from Boston who was a sensational model at the Royal Academy in London, and he seemed to have the ability to transform himself from one kind of classical original to another, from Apollo Belvedere to the Hercules, quite effortlessly, it seems. And of course there were other models too. I think we should go on, and Gillian, if you...
I'm ready.
Yep.
Good morning. Hip-hop artist Nicki Minaj's mobilization of various alter egos, elaborate body presentation, and adoption of the Barbie brand have made her the target of critiques concerning bad body and race politics. She is often viewed as conforming to Eurocentric norms of beauty and stereotypes of excessive black sexuality, in addition to having a fake body modified by plastic surgery. Discourses about the artist's fakery have circulated in various cultural sites. Her counterfeit form has been referenced in raps by other artists. And following the release of her single Looking Ass in 2014, for which she utilized an image of Malcolm X in the promotion, a video circulated online juxtaposing a speech by X on black self-hate with images of Minaj's body centering on her blonde hair, body shape, and skin complexion. Okay. Troublingly, it continues to be common sense to perceive of women of color who appear to be citing European body aesthetics as expressing a pathological racial shame. So Minaj has confronted these critiques of her fakery in interviews and in several songs, from her recent hit Only to her much celebrated verses in Kanye West's Monster, where she raps, "And if I'm fake, I ain't noticed 'cause my money ain't." The aim of my talk today is to reframe the critical optic through which we view Minaj's body and the bodies of women of color more broadly by assessing the political potential of fakery. In particular, I analyze how the once vilified, hyper-feminine aesthetics of the Rococo have been deployed in images of the rapper, and I theorize how these images disturb hierarchies of race, gender, beauty, and sexuality. In some instances, I will use the term Rococo to signify an 18th century style, but I also deploy it to more capaciously index what art historian Melissa Hyde describes as a cultural mode of being, thought, and representation that centers femininity, non-normative masculinity, dreams, and resistance. I suggest that the label fake is mobilized to discipline women and girls of color into performing gender and racial authenticity by deriding their potential to signify radical subjectivities through their body aesthetics. Thus, I locate a potent politics of pink and plastic for racialized women who are continually subject to what Hortense Spillers describes as high crimes against the flesh. And so these are just some montages that float around the internet about her supposed fake body. It's likely that Minaj's appropriation of Barbie and of the exalted white femininity the doll embodies marks her as racially transgressive, especially because she does not fashion herself in the image of the black Barbie dolls marketed to girls of color that have dark hair and skin. To take up white femininity in such a way is to show how whiteness is open to semiotic resignification by women of color. 18th century Rococo aesthetics centered on the white female subject as muse, and Minaj's incarnation of the style marks her trespass into this privileged visual field. Minaj's highly performative and ornamental visual styling, especially from 2009 to about 2013, can be described as Rococo. However, in examining the aesthetic politics of Minaj's fakery, I'm particularly interested in a spread in the fashion magazine W, in which she's styled by contemporary Italian artist Francesco Vizzoli. Vizzoli gained attention in the art world by appropriating canonical works by artists such as Leonardo da Vinci and replacing the original figures with the faces of models such as Naomi Campbell and Cindy Crawford. The artist is interested in the cultural obsession with celebrity and the iconic status of famous women in particular. Like Minaj, Vizzoli has also been framed as something of a fake, an artist whose work has too intimate a relationship with the market. In the interview of Vizzoli that accompanies the photographs of Minaj and W, MoMA curator Klaus Biesenbach directs rather aggressive questions to the artist, suggesting that he has recently sold out to the art market by departing from his earlier work as a performance artist. The practice of Vizzoli, like that of Rococo artist Francois Boucher, is devalued through a rhetoric of inauthenticity that stems from his association with perceived vain, hyper-feminine women. The photo story by Vizzoli styles Minaj as a courtier in French Rococo style. Rococo imaging emerged in the late 18th century and is marked by opulent surfaces, bucolic landscapes, fleshy, voluptuous figures, and pastel pinks, blues, and greens. In Making Up the Rococo, Melissa Hyde describes how the vilification of the Rococo style, and of artist Francois Boucher in particular, emerged in the late 18th century in tandem with early Enlightenment discourse. These negative judgments sought to police the gender and class transgressions that were signaled by the aesthetic excess of Rococo style, which came to symbolize for critics the moral and material decadence of the French aristocracy. Hyde analyzes how the politics of adornment signaled the subversion of social hierarchies in 18th century France, and how this subversion was symbolized by the body practices of women, namely the practice of applying makeup or rouge to the face. Figures such as Madame de Pompadour, who was a patron of Boucher and performed her application of makeup in the public company of the court, became a target of criticism for embodying feminine deceit and social climbing. Such judgments are echoed in the contemporary cultural discourses surrounding Nicki Minaj's fake body and the manner in which she has allegedly modified it for market success. Boucher was also disparaged for his marked use of pink in his paintings. Hyde notes how, for critics, the color indexed the decline of art practice that was brought about through the growing participation of women in the art world through their commissioning of portraits that reduced serious male painters to lowly makeup artists. Pink evoked the bodies of women that were framed as surface and no substance, and whose excessive approaches to body crafting reflected those of prostitutes. The fact that Minaj has consistently used pink for her branding likely feeds the discourse of fakery, which stems from sexist evaluations of feminine aesthetics as frivolous at best and morally debased at worst. Minaj's sexual body presentation, coupled with her Rococo style, marks her deviance from norms of sexual and stylistic respectability. In fact, Vasoli cited Minaj's performance of hypersexuality as what prompted him to draw on Rococo style in executing his portraits, and he fashioned her in the image of influential women of the French court who obtained their positions in significant part through the adornment and sexual capital of their bodies. In Vasoli's photographs, Minaj's body is swathed in complicated feminine dresses constructed from lustrous fabrics festooned with bows, tulle, and ribbons. Heavily ornamented gilded frames accent the photographs and cite Rococo painting display. In the images, Minaj's facial expressions range from subdued to dramatic, consisting of intense stares, looks away, and awkward half smiles. Although the photographs mark her body through a femininity that is softer and more digestible than the visual chaos of her self-named Harajuku Barbie styles, she does not appear more naturalistic or approachable. In this portrait, the rapper stands in profile in an elaborate lavender dress while gripping a metallic brown curtain with both hands. The curtain runs snake-like down the length of her body, framing its sensuous contours and drawing the eye to her buoyant and accented décolletage. Minaj's delicate yet firm hold on the curtain makes it appear like a strangled phallus. Her makeup and well-coiffed hair are naturalistic and soft, contrasting with her wide open eyes that reveal the whites. Minaj's face in the photograph is similar to the expression she makes when embodying her angry, masculine alter ego Roman, giving her a menacing appearance. Minaj is seated frontally in an intricately decorated white gown and Rococo portrait of Minaj as Jeanne Baku, Comtesse du Barry. She wears a gray wig gathered into a tight, orderly bun on the side of her head and looks out at the viewer with a defiant gaze, holding a lyre in one hand and a wreath of roses in the other. At her feet are a palette, paints, brushes, and an embroidery frame enclosing Vasoli's initials. The image serves as a collaborative self-portrait, the lyre representing Minaj's musical practice, and the needle points and paints at her feet indexing the tools of Vasoli's trade as a visual artist. Minaj's position in the chair indicates that her legs are open wide underneath the voluminous gown, out from which a foot enclosed in a dainty, ornately patterned shoe emerges. At her feet are not only Vasoli's craft materials, but also the broken, classically styled bust of a female figure. Here, the aesthetics of white femininity and the labor of a white male European artist come under her sage and stoic command. One finds not lack under her dress, but signs of generation and destruction. So just to forward along, so I'm interested in the connection between Minaj and Madame de Pompadour that Vasoli stages. And it seems like I'm getting less than 15 minutes, but I'll just sum up. What I argue is that, in fact, this is a collaborative self-portrait, that it's a self-portrait of Vasoli as it is a self-portrait of, a portrait of Nicki Minaj. So my question is, what does it mean for a black woman as object to be conflated with a white male artist as subject? Minaj uses Vasoli as he uses her, since he makes possible the trafficking of her racialized body in both high art and high fashion registers. Black female bodies have been persistently excluded from these realms, save for the common tropes of primitivism or an exotic kind of otherness. In thinking further about the race politics of Minaj's Rococo embodiment, sorry, I'm like getting ahead of myself. I find it useful to imagine Minaj as a female dandy, the Madame as a dandy. In Slaves to Fashion, Monica Miller examines how the figure of the black male dandy signifies the complex nexus of gender and race that attends black styling practices, which often articulate challenges to racialization. I find that Minaj's hyper-feminine style also engages the attentiveness of dandyism, and I argue that her deployments of fancy high-fashion clothes and Rococo aesthetics are one of the modes through which her challenges to gender, race, and sexual hierarchies are articulated. It's through her fake body and the plasticized pink that marks it where we can locate the possibilities that Minaj has generated for imaginative ways of being and embodying for women and girls of color. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And do we have time for questions? Yes. We do? Good. Questions? Yes.
Hi, I have a question. Actually, Yuri McMillan did a talk yesterday on Nicki Minaj, and I was curious as to this idea of her controlling her own image and how that measures up with this idea of the Jezebel, the archetype of the black woman as Jezebel. Whether that's something that you think she deliberately chooses to embrace, or is she even aware of that archetype? And this is for Jillian.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes. So I guess it's really hard. I definitely do attribute a lot of authorship to Nicki Minaj. I immerse myself in her music and her interviews and her press performances, and so she talks a lot about her craft work, particularly as a writer of rap. When it comes to image production, I do attribute some authorship, but also recognize, right, that there are stylists involved, there are recording industry executives involved. In the case of the portraits I'm talking about, Vasoli really is staging a lot of this, but also recognizing that in that staging, I'm sure there's some kind of complex negotiation happening with Minaj too, about how she's performing in that moment. So what I'm really interested in is partly the intentionality, but more importantly, the effects of the images themselves, right? So what meaning-making work are they doing out in the world? And so I feel like she's very aware of what the tropes are about black women's sexuality, and I actually, if I was able to finish, I end with her image from Anaconda, her single, and the interesting kind of very anti-racist feminist act that she did where she posted that image of her in Anaconda on Instagram, and then also posted images of a Sports Illustrated cover of 3 white girls in bikinis. And whereas the Sports Illustrated image of these white women was totally innocuous, you can get it at a supermarket, right? Her image was already being vilified, you know, and being framed as dangerous for black women and black girls, right? So she wrote on Instagram with the Sports Illustrated models like innocent, harmless or something, and then under hers like, I forget now, but like dangerous or something. So she's very aware, I think, of the kind of racial and gender economy in which her image is circulating. And she actually said that she was advised to not use that image of herself for Anaconda. In fact, she insisted. So I think the more she produces, I think the more power she has to kind of like claim a sort of authorship. Thank you.
Yes, another question.
I suppose the question is largely to Dr. Bindman. For us in the region, part of the material that is coming out, but which it hasn't specifically addressed, is the issue of black artists producing black images of black people in the Caribbean setting. So while there are a number of emerging discourses around imagery of black people being produced by European artists, there is a much smaller and more, and perhaps for us, more important framing of the way in which at what time do black people begin to image themselves in that setting. For us, so far, material only emerges from about the 18th century, but there has to have been material being produced before. And I wonder to what extent that is emerging in this project. Thank you.
Yes, that's a very interesting question. There certainly were black artists in the 17th century. the most famous one being Juan de Pareja, who was an assistant to Velázquez. And in the volume, 3.1, there's actually the portrait by Velázquez of Juan de Pareja and a self-portrait by Juan de Pareja in the painting juxtaposed. There are records of other black artists who are quite a lot more shadowy in the 17th century, but in the 18th century there are a recognizable number, and there are also some very shadowy ones that we know we have references to but haven't come out. But that's something that was specifically focused on in the 20th century volumes, and I wrote an introduction which in a way tried to look back into the 19th century to some of the people like Edmonia Lewis, who again I thought hadn't really been given proper coverage in the 19th century volume. So that history is emerging, but I think there's more work to be done, and there are records of 17th century Dutch artists who seem to have colonial ancestry as well. And of course there are also a few others who are known to have been mixed race as well in France. So I think that more will come out as time goes on. And of course it depends on the circumstances whether they wish to be identified as such and whether it's possible to know in a lot of cases. But there are, particularly around Haiti, you begin to find consciousness coming out among black artists. And of course we do have sections in the 20th century volumes on the Caribbean and of South America. And there is an essay on the Caribbean, which is again entirely the story of black artists.
This is directed to the entire panel. I'm interested in the vast contrast between images of Europe versus the images of North America, particularly antebellum black imagery versus the black imagery that we're looking at this morning. In comparison, we're talking about the tropes of Orientalism, this Moorish depiction, sexualization, exotification. However, underlying all of that is some sentiment of beauty, some sentiment of desire, some sentiment of wanting to freeze an image of black in time in a way that contrasts strongly against the images that have been frozen in North America, such as the Mammy, Sambo, picking any type of artifacts that we have and are still reproduced now. How can we account for that difference? Is this to imply perhaps a different sentimentality underlying the type of chattel slavery that was going on between the two areas, between Europe and the New World?
It's my conviction that in Britain, having looked at a lot of these paintings, particularly in the portraiture genre, that at certain stages British artists really enjoyed and sought out figures of African ancestry for their pictorial qualities, actually their aesthetic qualities, that British artists became, not totally, I mean it was their bread and butter, but all British portraitists had to spend their lives painting Anglo-Dutch pink and white squashy faces like mine. And what they really liked to paint was a much more sculptural. The light falls differently on dark skin, and the facial features are different, and British artists seem to have really enjoyed this, up to a point, obviously, but there is certainly an aesthetic enjoyment of the black figure.
I mean, can I also say that in the 18th century there are portraits of plantation owners with black slaves that are very close to European, well, in fact, are by European artists anyway, who were in the South. And then you've got a lot of cross-culture with prints, for instance, often quite racist, that begin in London and are then copied. And there's a whole series about Philadelphia, which are very closely related to London prints. Anyway, I think that I'm being told that time is up, rather about to be hauled off the stage.
Thank you so much to our first panel.